Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hack. Really excited today. Alina, who's with us?
We're joined today by Peter Campbell, who is a renowned underwater archaeologist. He's held a number of high-profile positions, but he's actually the assistant director at the British School at Rome. Peter, hi.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh wow, Rome. How are things in Italy?
It's a bit bizarre at the moment, as you can imagine. We're completely on lockdown, and just to go outside, we have to have a paperwork that from the government saying we're either going to essential work or to go to the grocery store or to go to the hospital, and otherwise you cannot go outside. So it's quite restrictive and kind of otherworldly here in Rome.
So my latest thing with coronavirus is yesterday I got asked to go to the supermarket for a really old sick lady because I was doing a doorstep drop anyway for Sex Pest, who's like the greatest man ever, but he's like one of the people on the list that can't leave his house. And people now stand in the queue judging what's in your basket. Like I could see the guy behind me looking at the 6 bottles of wine going, they're not essential, you didn't have to leave the house for those. And like people are shaming people online as well. So someone went to Aldi, and like the middle of it is like a jumble sale anyway, and someone had obviously done their shopping. I thought, oh, I could do with a new bin, I'm going to grab that. And someone else has taken a picture and put them on Twitter, and I'm like, seriously, have we come to that? I mean, if they sell a bin in the shop and you want a bin, it's like the guy was looking at the bottles of wine like I was Satan incarnate.
I'm guilty of that. I did that yesterday actually, because in Poland the new restrictions are for basically every cashier that's open, only 3 people can be in the shop. So 2 cashiers are open, 6 people are allowed in the shop. And there's me standing in the queue, and there's a woman complaining that the elderly get a special time. And she was like, oh, I got here really early, and then I had to stand here for hours because of these old people. Why do old people? And I was, do you know what? And then I shamed her on Twitter. So I have no shame shaming people.
Oh, no, like some people deserve to be shamed on Twitter, but people judging what's in the basket of the person in front, get a life, people. It's going too far now. The old lady wanted the wine, I bought it for her, and I'm not sorry at all. Peter, have you had any mad corona nonsense going on there?
It hasn't been too bad, but there was, I saw a homeless man being stopped and arrested by the police. Oh, well, I don't know if he was being arrested or just being taken to get treatment or something, because he was coughing really badly, so maybe he needed treatment. But it took 6 police cars for them to deal with him. So, I mean, I think they're taking it very seriously. And, you know, I really feel bad for the homeless people, because what are they supposed to do in this sort of thing? So I hope that they're getting help.
It's insane. So here, hotels that are empty, obviously, have opened up, and there are homeless people sleeping in the rooms for now to keep them safe. But I saw a photograph of a parking lot in Nevada, and what they've done is get white paint out and paint boxes on the floor of the parking lot, so that when the homeless people go to sleep on the floor, they're at a suitable social distance from the next homeless person. And I'm like, really? That's not really a solution, is it?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, in some ways, these sort of crises bring out the best in people, where you have kind of communities coming together and working together to buy things that people need that can't leave their homes, or you know, people singing on balconies. And then in other ways, it brings out the worst in people. And the fact that they, with all the homes that are vacant and hotels and all that kind of thing, that the fact that they can't put the homeless people in the US in beds is just absolutely tragic.
Let's get away from coronavirus. I'm so excited that you've joined us, because in my head, you are basically Dirk Pitt. You are an underwater archaeologist, and you spend your life diving and finding exciting stuff. I hope you don't spend the equal amount of time getting shot at and beaten up as he does. But how did you get involved in underwater archaeology?
I actually get shot at a lot less now that I'm doing underwater than when I was working on land. So that's actually a good benefit of moving underwater. Yeah, I mean, I was doing terrestrial archaeology for a long time, and it was just sort of tedious excavating layer by layer. And I when I was a student, I thought, you know, there has to be a more exciting version of this. And so that's when I went back to do my master's and then PhD in underwater archaeology. And I was absolutely correct. It's much more exciting underwater than it is on land, though I do love working on land as well.
So you haven't raised the Titanic like Dirk Pitt, but you have done some amazing stuff. Talk to us about sunken cities. How prevalent are they, and how often do you come across them, and where are they?
Yeah, underwater archaeology is about more than just shipwrecks. There's actually a lot of stuff down there, and sunken cities are one of the most exciting and interesting. There's actually thousands of sunken cities around the world, and I focus on the Mediterranean region, but you find them pretty much everywhere because you have global sea level change, which occurred from essentially 18,000 years ago at the last glacial maxima, so when the glaciers were the largest that they were, until around 5,000 years ago when we reached kind of this equilibrium where we are now with global sea level. And so you have all of these settlements and other types of sites from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic that are submerged, these massive tracts of land. I mean, just huge, almost subcontinents in some cases, like Doggerland, which are submerged. And then from around 5,000 years ago until present, you have localized sea level change. So this is where all of that weight from the glaciers caused changes in the Earth's crust, and that crust is still rebounding. And so you have sites like Pavlo Petri, which is one site that I was fortunate to work on, which is in Greece, and it is the world's oldest sunken city. So it dates from the late Neolithic until the Mycenaean period, and with the main concentration kind of in the Bronze Age, kind of the Minoan period for people who know the Minoans. It's just a fascinating city in about 2 to 3 meters of water, so really shallow. Most sunken cities are very shallow. Because of wave action and things, you know, all the walls are mostly broken down, but you can still swim over roads, and you see building foundations and thresholds. So you kind of see the doorways that exit from the buildings on the interior out to the streets. So there's whole road networks, and we have communal buildings. So there's a communal building right in the middle of the city that had kind of drinking glasses. So you can see people were, you know, cheersing each other and drinking around this communal building, and then drunkenly discarding and smashing their glasses outside. And then tombs. So there's Tholos tombs, these kind of big crypts that you could go into. So I mean, it's a whole Bronze Age city just sitting there in relatively shallow water.
That's amazing. So what's the best thing you found there?
Probably the storehouses, which kind of indicate this long distance trade that was occurring even in the Bronze Age. So you have residential houses, which are quite obvious, and then you have kind of administrative houses, and you have these kind of communal buildings, and then you have these kind of storehouses that are where they were storing kind of large containers that were moving goods back and forth around the Aegean and perhaps further afield.
And how do you go about finding a sunken city? Do you use documentary evidence first to know where it is and then go looking? Or is it just a case of getting out there and getting underwater and trying to find one?
Well, it's gotten a lot easier these days than it was in the past. In the past, you know, it was just spending time in the field, just kind of walking coastlines, going around, talking to locals, trying to find out, you know, is there pottery in the sea, that sort of thing. These days, we have really great models of tectonic changes. So you can kind of see where areas are lifting up and where areas are submerging, and you can go look in the areas that are submerging. So like Crete, for example, the west end of Crete is lifting up in the air. So you're not going to find any sunken cities there, but the east side of Crete is submerging. And so you have a number of sunken cities on the east side of Crete. So now that we have these kind of rough models of, well, they're getting quite refined models of tectonic changes, we can identify where sunken cities are likely to be.
While you're on here, people are going to think of one place when you mention sunken cities, and I'm going to be one of them, because this has been going through my mind the whole time you've been speaking about the sunken cities. What is the deal with Atlantis? Please don't judge me, people. Do not judge me. So from the point of view of an actual professional, can you basically cut through the crap and tell us more about it?
Yes, absolutely. Atlantis is not real. 100%. It was a story just told to convey a message, essentially that you shouldn't mess with Athens. Completely fictional. But that doesn't mean that people don't, every time you mention Sunken Cities, people want to know about Atlantis. I've worked on 2 different sites that people have said were inspired Plato to write the Atlantis myth. One was Eggetty, which is a city that was sunk in the 5th century BC by a tsunami. And then the other was Pavlo Petri. And both of them would have been ruins in the ocean, contemporary with Plato. So, Sunken cities were a reality of ancient life in Greece. People would have seen them, and they would have experienced events that did submerge cities. However, Atlantis itself was very much created to convey a message, but it was not based on any actual evidence of an actual place that existed.
That's really sad, in a way.
Well,
it was a definitive answer, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because Atlantis was taken to be a myth and completely fictional until kind of British late 19th century, early 20th century kind of penny dreadfuls. And then people just they loved the story so much from these kind of comic books and things that they wanted it to be real. And then there are all these kind of people in the 60s and 70s who are like, well, maybe it can be real. Let's go search in, the Bahamas and all this kind of absolutely craziness.
It kind of ties in with Conan Doyle wrote that Lost World book as well, didn't he? Where they discovered like dinosaurs in South America and stuff. It seemed to be a thing with the Victorians.
Yes, absolutely.
So earlier when we were actually having a chat before we started recording, you mentioned, well, before that, we were talking about what we should define you as, marine archaeologist or underwater, and you actually mentioned working in caves. Is there anything else you can tell us, like your favorite places or any interesting artifacts you found in any caves?
Yeah, I like to refer to myself as an underwater archaeologist because I work in every possible type of environment, and marine kind of conjures up the sea, but I work in rivers and lakes and underwater caves. And so I had a book that came out in 2017, an edited volume called The Archaeology of Underwater Caves. And it's the first book really to bring together a global perspective on these really important sites. So I spent a bit of time in North America diving in kind of very muddy, low visibility, kind of gross lakes, and then also some time in Albania diving in pristine, crystal clear. Some of the video that we live streamed to students, they didn't realize that we were actually underwater because it was so clear. It looked like we were just kind of inside a regular cave. So anyone interested in diving in caves, I recommend Albania instead of North America. But yeah, I mean, these are really fascinating sites in that you have really 2 main types. You have caves that were dry at the time of the last glacial maxima. So, like we were talking about before, when global sea levels were much lower, these were dry caves and people were living in them. They were creating art and they were doing really interesting things. And then global sea levels rose and submerged them. And so now you dive far back inside of these and you can find, in the case of Cosquer Cave in France, you have these beautiful, you go down at 40 meters and you dive through the caverns and then you pop up in an air bubble and you have these beautiful Paleolithic paintings that are a lot like Lascaux Cave and some of these other famous French caves, but it's, the entrance is submerged. So there's a lot of potential for that. And then the other type of underwater cave site are these kind of wells and springs like Bath in the UK, where for centuries people have been throwing religious offerings and other things inside of them. And so you dive down inside and you go straight to the bottom and you find collections of artifacts and votive offerings, and you can find little statuettes, and occasionally you find people that were thrown in and that sort of thing. So they're really an interesting, different type of site from what you find in the ocean, like Shipwrecks or Sunken Cities.
I'm sold. You need to provide some more information after this podcast because I desperately need to go. It is my new hobby, basically. So thank you for telling us about this.
Peter, as well, you have to understand that she is a complete Philistine when it comes to anything to do with water or boats. So if you've sold her, you're winning at life, basically.
Thanks for that.
Peter, you've already mentioned it. I'm guessing mainly your work constitutes the obvious, and that's shipwrecks.
That's right. Yeah, I primarily work on shipwrecks, just because there are so many, and then also my area of focus is primarily the Mediterranean in the Greek and Roman periods.
So yeah, again, an endless stream there. Tell us about, you've excavated like a ship graveyard, haven't you?
That's right. Yeah, in Forni in Greece, a little tiny archipelago, we found what happens to be the largest concentration of ancient shipwrecks in the Mediterranean. So we started speaking to fishermen and sponge divers, and they said, oh, there's a shipwreck over here and over there and that sort of thing. And we thought, okay, we can put together a project. And when we went to start searching, we found out that their information was really, really, really good. And on the very first day, we found 4 shipwrecks. And then shortly thereafter, we had a day where we found 6. And in the first season, we found 22. And the second season, 23. And it just kept going up. And so now we're at 58 shipwrecks in a little tiny insignificant archipelago that insignificant in terms of it never had large cities built on it or anything like that. It was very much a navigational point. And so lots of ships were passing by and anchoring and stopping and that sort of thing, but not unloading cargo. So it's incredibly significant in terms of the navigational landscape in the Mediterranean, and specifically in the Aegean. And just over the centuries, dozens of ships have sank, and we don't know the total number yet. We're still working, and hopefully we can start excavating in the near future, because some of these wrecks are really important. They date from around 550 BC all the way to 1920, where we have a vessel that was carrying Fix, the modern Greek beer.
That's incredible. Go on.
Can Alex and I join you on this? Because it actually really sounds like a really good laugh and something that we could do. Because I was meant to do my diving license this summer, and well, God knows what's going to happen now. But oh my, I'd love to come and like have a look and work on some of this stuff. I mean,
we'll just shovel dirt for you, basically. If you need minions, we're there.
The great thing about Forni is that, you have wrecks at every possible depth. So some of them are very deep, kind of pushing our limits of kind of mixed gases. They're down at 45 meters or deeper. Some of them, the deepest one's at 65 meters. So incredibly challenging dive. But then others are, just in 2-3 meters of water. So really shallow. And actually, there's even a sunken village at Forni. So a lot like Pavlo Petri, there's this little village on one side of the island that's submerged. So just for good measure, we have shipwrecks and we have sunken cities there.
Which ship are you dying to get at the most when you start excavating?
So we have one shipwreck that it's carrying a cargo from the Black Sea, and it dates to around the 2nd century AD, so the Roman period. And it's carrying hundreds of amphoras, which are kind of large terracotta jugs with 2 handles that would hold all kinds of cargo like olive oil and herbs and things like that, and or fish sauce. And this type of amphora has been known since the 50s and found in excavations on land, but a complete one has never been found, only in fragments. And so here we have a cargo, a ship carrying thousands of them. So, I mean, it's absolutely incredible to be able to see what they look like whole and then try and figure out, okay, they're coming from the Black Sea. Where are they going? Are they heading towards Athens? Are they heading out to the Levant? Who were they trading with? What were they exchanging? So it's kind of revealing this whole story of this thing that was only known as fragmentary remains before this.
The closet archaeologist in me read an article about this actually, so that would be really, really incredible to see if you guys are able to bring anything up. Very, very excited. But enough about my closet archaeologyness. Classicist ancient historyness.
Are you just making up words now, Ellie? Go on.
Yeah. So, what are the most famous wrecks you've ever dived on?
Let's see. I worked for a while on the Hunley, which was the first successful submarine. So it sank in 1865. It sank a Union vessel in the U.S. off of South Carolina, and it was constructed and operated by the Confederate States. And so I worked on that, trying to understand how it sank and why it sank and what happened to the people that were still stuck on the inside, because all the bodies of the crew were still inside. So that was quite interesting. I would say, I worked on the Queen Anne's Revenge, which was Blackbeard's shipwreck. So it's probably the most famous pirate ship that's been excavated. It sank off of North Carolina in the U.S. And that's been a long multi-year project that's been fascinating. And I was just there for a very short time. What else?
To be honest, you don't need to think of any more. They're both quite epic in terms of shipwrecks.
Well, I'm trying to think of ones that people have heard of, because there's been a bunch of kind of famous ships regionally and things. So like the Wawona, which was the first ship on the National Register in the U.S. The Vasa in Sweden. The Vasa was this beautiful ship that sank on its maiden voyage in Stockholm Harbor and was raised in the 1960s and is now on display in a beautiful museum in the very heart of Stockholm. It's a 17th century ship, and it was the basis for the ship in the Goonies in the movie, if you guys have seen that.
Everyone's seen it.
So it looks like it's just an amazing vessel.
Anyone who hasn't seen the Goonies needs to go and
do.
We're on lockdown. If you haven't watched that by tomorrow night, you're dead to me.
It's a classic.
What?
It is a classic.
How do I manage all of this work and a film?
You have to make time for the Goonies.
I'll watch it. I promise I'll watch it.
Yeah, tell her, Peter. Is that what made you want to be a marine or an underwater archaeologist?
Yeah, probably the Goonies and Indiana Jones probably got me into archaeology. That's probably why I'm here. So
have you ever found treasure like that?
I have dove on, I'm probably getting close to 1,000 shipwrecks, and I have never seen any gold or silver at all.
That's sad.
Wow.
Well, it's not really what we're looking for, because we're trying to like reveal these stories about like the everyday people, and gold and silver were really quite rare in the past in actuality. But it kind of highlights every single ship I've ever dove on, I think, has had some sort of destruction from people looking for gold and silver.
Oh, really?
So people are convinced that all of these ships are pirate ships or have gold and silver and that sort of thing, and they're destroying them at a huge rate. I mean, and these are non-renewable resources, so it's not like natural resources where if you stop fishing for a while, they'll come back. Once these things are, damaged and destroyed, there's no fixing it. So yeah, I mean, so there isn't gold and silver on 99% of all of these shipwrecks, yet people are kind of rummaging through them, using dynamite in some cases, trying to get at gold that doesn't exist.
Infuriating.
So we're talking about general shipwrecks here. I want to change the subject just a tiny bit and talk about a few battle shipwrecks. Have you worked on any of those?
Yeah, in all different time periods, but probably the most famous one is the Battle of the Eggetty Islands. So this is a project off the coast of Western Sicily, and it's a naval battle between Rome and Carthage that happened on March 10th, 241 BC. And it's the only ancient naval battle that's been found by archaeologists. So we know lots about ancient naval battles from historical sources, but this is the first time we have tangible evidence of what an ancient naval battle looks like. And we found these large bronze rams. These are these kind of oddly shaped things that would fit on the front of the warships. And then in this time period, they would try and smash into the enemy to try and get them to sink. So you're kind of turning your warship into a kind of torpedo that's human propelled. And this is it's a deep site. It's almost 100 meters deep, out in the middle of the open ocean. So it's a really challenging site, and it's spread over a huge area because these ships smashed into each other and then broke apart on the surface and percolated through the water column. So it's not like a nice pile of amphoras like we find with merchant ships. Instead, it's completely distributed. I mean, you can really get the trauma of the battle by looking at how spread apart it is, because I mean, it just looks like explosions happened. But it's incredibly important because this is the earliest Roman military assemblage we have, and it's the only naval battle we have. So we're kind of rewriting all kinds of books on the Roman Navy and Roman military and Carthaginian Navy and military.
You say you've worked on sort of all time periods. Alina and I are boring 20th century war historians. What kind of warships from that period have you been and had a look at?
Well, there are loads of World War I and World War II wrecks all over the place. So off of Albania, we found the Regina Margherita, which was the World War I flagship of Italy. But it sank in World War II. And so by World War II, it had been kind of relegated to being a tender and supply vessel, a supporting vessel. And it struck a mine off the coast of Albania and sank there. So it's fascinating in terms of World War I warship design, but then also as World War II kind of reuse of earlier vessels that were not as armored. There's a hospital ship that we found. It was well known because it's incredibly shallow. You can see it on Google Earth if you look in Saranda Bay in Albania. And it's a large hospital ship that was very sadly bombed by the Germans while full of injured Italian soldiers who were heading home. So after Italy capitulated, Germany was incredibly upset that Italy was no longer in the war. And so they started attacking Italians. And so this kind of retribution phase resulted in a lot of Italian casualties. And so this hospital ship was fully loaded with Italian troops that had been injured in Albania and were heading back to Italy. And then a German aircraft strafed it and sunk it in the harbor. And so it's still sitting there on one side today.
I was just going to raise the fact that some of these sites that you dive to are graveyards, aren't they?
They are, yeah, and quite solemn. And because I worked on tall ships myself and have been at sea. And so it's quite, every time you find a wreck, you have this incredible moment of excitement at finding something that nobody has seen, or potentially nobody or very few people have seen in sometimes thousands of years. But then it's also kind of muted by the realization that in some cases, people died on board this wreck. That's incredibly evident on the naval sites. So both World War II, but then also the naval battle between Rome and Carthage, where you have helmets and things that indicate, people died here. But then also on the merchant ships, I mean, some of the wrecks that we found in Forni in Greece, they're right on these massive, massive cliffs. And if they went down in a storm, there's just nowhere for the sailors to go. So, I mean, they must have drowned on that site. And so you're always incredibly respectful that these are graveyards, that people died on these sites. And so every action you do it cognizant of the fact that you're trying to tell these people's story, rather than kind of profit or take advantage or exploit.
Just going back to my Dirk Pitt thing, because it is the only measure I have for underwater archaeology, because I'm a total novice when it comes to the subject. He gets into quite a lot of trouble. Have you ever, when you're diving, obviously sometimes you're exploring unknown places and that, can it be dangerous? Have you ever had any close shaves?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be close shaves. There's always a bit of danger. People are always the most dangerous part of anything. So humans are always the ones you need to worry about. By and large, we have very safe diving practices. It's mostly on land that we get into trouble where, in some places you have to worry about organized crime, trying to shake you down or get bribes. It's often on land that the really kind of dangerous bit happens. But in the water, things do happen. So, I mean, you do have marine life. I'm never very worried about sharks because they're mostly just kind of interested. They're kind of like dogs in that they're just interested in what you're doing. They kind of hang slightly out of view and kind of keep an eye on you and trying to figure out what you're doing. You have to be careful if you're poking your fingers in places because there's things like eels that are more scared of you than you should be of them. But if you poke a finger in a den, then they'll definitely take off your finger. And then you have some things like I had two colleagues that were diving in one of our usual caves in Albania that has not been dove very much. We were doing some of the early exploration of it. And while they were down there, there was a rock slide. And so they were down quite deep, and all of a sudden everything just went completely black and they couldn't see anything. And they just heard this enormous sound. And then on the surface, there was just a huge amount of sediment that was coming out, and it turned the entire crystal clear water into just a muddy mess. And it took a long time for that to clear out. And fortunately, it happened deeper than where they were, and so they weren't taken down with the rock slide. But that's the kind of thing that you don't know what's going to happen. Every dive you plan very carefully because any number of things can go wrong. You get trapped under a rock slide at depth, and that's the end of you.
We've mentioned Atlantis, but in terms of documented places that we know existed that are lost, so it could be a city, a shipwreck, if you could find anything that's missing, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a good question. I've always wanted to find an Athenian trireme. So, Athens was this incredible naval superpower that ruled, the Eastern Mediterranean, but we've never actually found their ships that they did it. This is the heart of this is the wooden walls that made Athens a power, and we've never actually found one of those. So I would love to find one of those. And then, there's a bunch of kind of lesser known sites that I would love to find. There's a site right on the border between Montenegro and Albania that Montenegrin divers have been kind of slipping under the water over for years and illegally looting and pulling up these incredible little statuettes and these silver coins, Roman coins and things, and eluding officials and law enforcement. But if we could find that, it looks like a really important Roman period shipwreck that could tell us a whole lot about what the trade was in the Eastern Adriatic at that time. But it's kind of one of these ghost ships that we've seen the evidence from, but nobody's, legitimate working with governments has been able to find.
I'm looking at this from the perspective of Titanic and Lusitania, because that's my wheelhouse and that. But jurisdiction can be a big problem, can't it, when you're dealing with oceans and water and boundaries and who owns what?
Yeah, the oceans really are kind of the Wild West of today, and people really do have free reign. Governments have control over a certain amount of territorial waters, and then there's international guidelines that take over. So really nobody should be kind of salvaging and treasure hunting ships that are older than 100 years anywhere in the world, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And so shipwrecks are actually a really rapidly declining resource just because people smash them up looking for anything of value. So recently off of Indonesia, a number of World War II wrecks belonging to Britain, the US, and the Netherlands have completely disappeared. So they were identified and mapped as part of some scientific missions a couple of years ago, just quite recently. And then when those missions went back to kind of document them and kind of leave memorials for the dead soldiers and everything like that, they found that there was nothing left but a hole in the ground. And it was scrappers teams going down and salvaging everything from the bottom to then melt down and sell as steel. So, shipwrecks are disappearing at an alarming rate.
I've got to say, that is disgusting. I couldn't imagine that happening in my field. It does. It happens in the Holocaust. But taking basically graveyards and melting them down for scrap, I've got no words. I'm sorry.
I think the analogy of calling it the Wild West is a good one.
Yeah. And it happens much closer to home as well. Every shipwreck from the Battle of Jutland has been ripped open and copper wire and everything pulled out by salvers working in Europe. So, all of those ships have enormous damage.
The Invincible alone took 1,000 people down with her. That's a graveyard for 1,000 people. So to be stripping it for profit is, as Alina says, it's disgusting. Have you done Jutland?
I haven't, no, but some of my colleagues have been working on it for years, and it's incredibly exciting for them to find these wrecks. I think they've now found all of them. And but then to just see the damage done by the looters who are kind of sneaking in there and ripping up the decks and then trying to get at anything of value is just incredibly heartbreaking.
I mean, that happening in Pearl Harbor, that would never happen in Pearl Harbor. The Americans would be on it so fast, these people would be put into prison. It's, yeah, sorry, I'm a little bit annoyed right now.
Jurisdictionally, I guess it's easier to deal with somewhere like Pearl Harbor than it is to deal with somewhere like Jutland, which is not as close to the coast, and obviously the jurisdictions are a lot more fuzzy, isn't it?
No, it actually isn't. Sorry, but it's any Navy ship that sinks remains the property of the country in perpetuity. And then all of the ships at sea are being tracked and recorded their locations anyway. So it's actually relatively easy to create marine protected areas and say nobody's allowed to stop for several hours over this position. We know where the wrecks are. And then these days with satellite monitoring, I mean, you see these huge, miles and miles long plumes of oil coming off of these wrecks as they're being salvaged. So as they're salvaging them and ripping them up, they're releasing the oil, damaging the environment. And that can be seen from space, and that kind of thing can be easily monitored. There's kind of artificial intelligence, machine learning programs already mapping these sorts of things for the environmental damage. You could just say, okay, when we start seeing these plumes, we need to send, law enforcement there to stop the looting that's happening. At the end of the day, it's just archaeology, but we're very much a maritime world, even if we don't see it. I mean, if people sitting in their homes today look around at all the things around them, like 95% of those things were moved by cargo ships. And there's a lot of similarities in the past. The ancient Mediterranean was very much, even the Bronze Age was a globalized world with lots of people moving and exchanging goods and interacting and that sort of thing. And so maritime movement and connectivity is very much a human story. And I think for archaeology, it's been realized for some time, but now there's new tools and methods and more people getting involved in it. I think that it's really going to be a much larger sector of the field moving forward. So there's a lot to learn. You have these historians that are writing these kind of grand maritime narratives of culture and the sea and that sort of thing, from the corrupting sea to some popular books these days that are coming out. But archaeology has been kind of slower to mainstream it. And I think that in the next couple of years, you're going to see kind of some grand books being written about kind of maritime connectivity through archaeology. The development of the modern world, the development of the ancient world, who we are today based on, movement of people and goods by ships across great distances. So, I think it's a very human story that's going to take on wider prominence.
Are you going to write a book about it?
Well, I would love to, but I don't know that I have time. But maybe one day, years from now. Or, well, let's see how long the quarantine lasts. If this goes on for a year, then I'll probably have plenty of time.
I think I'm switching my specialty, Alex.
You say that with every guest we interview, though. You've banded about 12 different in the last 3 days. Yeah, it's true. The grass is always greener, isn't it? And then we go back to our piles of books and we think, oh.
Well, when I finished my undergraduate, I was digging holes in Mississippi in the U.S. This incredibly flat landscape, just trudging through mud, digging test pits and things. I was like, if I have to just dig holes for minimum wage, I might as well do it in the Mediterranean. And so I'll say, no matter what you're doing, it's always better on a beach.
Yeah, this is true.
You can do maritime archaeology and you can be on a beach all the time.
I think coming from someone who grew up about 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean in either direction, didn't you? It's a pretty big leap to make, but you definitely sold it to us. Join us tomorrow when we will be talking to Carolyn Day at Furman University in South Carolina about disease and about how at one point in history it was actually deemed fashionable to be dying. Very relevant and very topical for these days. So join us for that. Until then, stay safe. If you possibly can, stay home. This is Nighthawk signing off.